And as we watch the situation develop, there are still many questions we simply don't have the answer to. What was the point of making this film? Why did it instigate such unrest? And who is behind it? There are also a lot of questions about the bigger picture, what these protests mean for the geopolitical picture, and more specifically for the U.S. So for a look at the bigger picture, I'm joined now by Gareth Porter, investigative journalist and historian. Hi there, Gareth. Okay, so before we actually came onto this segment, you were talking a little bit about Egypt and how important of a role it plays. Why don't you go ahead and lay that out for us?
Well, I think that the events in Egypt are the most important of all of these incidents, all of the developments that we've seen unfold in the last few days, precisely because Egypt is the country that has the greatest influence over the rest of the Middle East. That is the country that most of the activists, Islamicists, particularly Islamic activists throughout the region, are looking to see what's happening there. This is, of course, the country that is going to have the most influence over the situation with regard to Israel and U.S. policy. So they're looking at the relationship between Israel and the United States, the relationship between Israel and Egypt, between Egypt and the United States. That's where I think we're going to see the greatest fallout from this this set of incidents. The violence in Egypt, I think, has to be seen as, in part, at least a reflection of the underlying anti-Americanism that has existed for many years in that society, particularly since 9/11. We have a lot of polling data that people have not been discussing, unfortunately, in recent days, that shows that in Egypt, more than in any other country that was the subject of intensive polling in the last few years, there's a very, very high incidence of anti-Americanism. As much as 93% of those polled showed anti-American sentiments, a lack of trust in the United States. But even very recently, we've had polls showing that 2/3 of the Arab world do not trust the United States. So what we're looking at here is an underlying tinderbox, which was essentially ready for any match that might be thrown for this kind of demonstration of anti-Americanism to be exhibited. Now, you know, I agree that the film itself was not that important. It's a minor irritant in the broader scheme of things, but what it shows is that it doesn't take very much. And I think that's why we are facing such a dangerous situation that should cause Americans to really rethink their relationship to the Islamic world, very fundamentally.
But Gareth, I have to ask, I mean, Mohamed Morsi actually, he did come out and say that he's supporting the U.S. in this. So we know that over a year ago that the people actually chose to throw out Mubarak. They chose Morsi, and yet he's kind of showing a discrepancy with what he is saying and what the people are believing from what you're saying. What's with this discrepancy?
Well, there's going to inevitably be some tension between Morsi's effort to get along with the United States and the West in general, and your intro there mentioned, you know, that he's looking for Western money, Western investment in Egypt, and that's one of the things he has to be concerned with, on one hand, and his necessary cultivation of the Islamist base in Egypt, which again represents, you know, a huge majority in the country, and much of which is really strongly, violently anti-American. So inevitably there's going to be this tension, and he's going to have to handle it very carefully. He can't come out too strongly in condemnation of everybody who's involved in these protests. At the same time, he has to make some statement, of course, distancing himself from it. So that's his dilemma, I think.
And what we're seeing right now is we saw the Arab Spring, and now we're starting to see what some, you know, you could almost call the Arab Fall. Maybe it's taking it a little bit too far, but there are over a dozen countries right now that are having protests, whether it's a few hundred people to a few thousand people. It's costing people their lives. So is this region just so unstable that nothing at this point is certain?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, it is unstable enough to say that nothing is very certain, except for this, that you have a set of Arab and Islamic countries in the region which are overwhelmingly anti-American, which do not trust the United States, and they do this, they have this attitude in large part because they view the United States as at war with Islam. And this is a reflection, of course, of the history of the last 10 years in particular, when the United States has gone to war in terms of sending ground forces as well as bombing in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now, of course, the drone war in Pakistan. That has solidified this view of the United States as anti-Islamic and hostile in a very violent way towards Islam. And so that is a fundamental issue, fundamental problem that the Bush administration failed to appreciate at all. And I think Obama had some appreciation of it when he was elected, but he's allowed the opportunity to do something about it to slip by, and instead he's continued the policies of the Bush administration in many ways.
And since we're on the topic of politics, let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on and how this has actually turned into a political game right now. We had John McCain come out and say that the situation in the Middle East is completely unraveling. We had a Romney aide come out and say that, you know, President Romney, if there was one, could have prevented this from happening. And then President Obama, of course, fired back and said that, you know, Mitt Romney tends to shoot before aiming. So we're seeing this political dialogue. It kind of seems like a little bit of a game here. What does it seem like to you? And is any of this discourse actually doing anything productive?
It's the usual partisan discourse, no question about that. I mean, both parties do this to some extent, but the Republicans now are in a very interesting position. In the last few years, they have become a party whose policy toward the Middle East is entirely oriented towards the interests of not just Israel, but the Likud party in Israel, that is to say, Netanyahu's party. And that means that they, of course, are violently against the Arab governments of the region in general. I mean, they are taking a position that mirrors precisely the Israeli view. The Israeli view being that the Arab Spring was an illusion, of course, and we always expected the Arab societies to become violently anti-Israel and violently anti-Western. So I think that part of the Republican problem is that they are so oriented in their attitude toward reflecting, mirroring what the Israelis believe and say. And I think that is going to get them into more and more serious problems as time goes by. It already has, obviously. I think Romney has really discredited himself by the statement that he has made, the statements he's made. And I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
And we only have about a minute left, so I'm being told, but I do want to kind of turn the conversation just one more time. Let's look at oil prices. We're already starting to see panic in the markets about oil prices. And I mean, I know that the October oil prices went up by about 1.2%, and futures breached $100 for the first time since May 4th. The problem is, or the question is, that many of these protests that are going on aren't actually surrounding the Gulf region. People are saying that it's not, that they're afraid that it's going to affect the supply line, but that might not necessarily be the case.
Look, I do not pose as a specialist on the oil markets. I was very familiar with the way the markets responded to the situation regarding Iran and the United States and Israel, and that was sort of understandable. It's less understandable why they should respond, certainly with any fundamental shift, because of these protests and this violence, because it clearly does not portend any fundamental shift in the status of oil markets. So I would really treat it at this point as a blip that doesn't really mean anything.
All right. Gareth Porter, historian and investigative journalist, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.